9a. Decoding Leonardo. According to legend, in the year 1505, near the Tuscan town of Fiesole, a great bird rose from Monte Cecere, Swan Mountain, and took to the air. No witness testimony remains of the event. But if anyone was present on that hillside, the most likely candidate is Leonardo da Vinci, a man whose ambition for many years had been to fly like a bird. Some 50 years later, an acquaintance, Girolamo Giordano, wrote, "Leonardo da Vinci attempted to fly, but failed. He was an excellent painter." To call Leonardo an excellent painter is like labeling Shakespeare a clever wordsmith. He was a true genius, recognized in his own time and idolized in ours. His paintings are as secret and seductive as himself, done with the hand of an angel, the intellect of a scientist, and the soul of a romantic. His drawings are among the most beautiful ever made. His most treasured painting, the Mona Lisa, is undoubtedly the most famous in the world. His love of painting notwithstanding, it was knowledge itself that was Leonardo's great love. Knowledge, and the experience from which it may be drawn. To acquire it, Leonardo turned to a diverse array of fields: mathematics, geometry, optics, astronomy, geology, botany, zoology, hydraulics, mechanics, anatomy, as well as painting and drawing. As an engineer, he could think in 4 dimensions, visualizing not only the shapes of mechanical parts, but also their interrelated motions. Among his designs for flight, Leonardo imagined parachutes, landing equipment, even an aerial screw that acted like the blades of a helicopter. But like so much else in his life, Leonardo's attempts to actually create a workable flying machine are a mystery. There remains only one enigmatic reference, in a notebook characteristically filled with phrases and sketches, in which he proclaims that his great bird will bring eternal glory to the nest where it was born. Birth of a Genius. Leonardo da Vinci was born in 1452, the illegitimate child of a peasant girl named Caterina and respected notary Piero da Vinci. Leonardo lived at first with his mother in a 3-room stone house on a hill just outside the village of Vinci, some 20 kilometers, 12 miles, west of Florence. In that idyllic Tuscan countryside began the youngster's lifelong love of nature, a love that would remain implicit in all of his later works. Around 1469, Leonardo's father took him to Florence, where the statesman Lorenzo de' Medici had established an academy where all arts were honored. For years, art had been an instrument of religious expression, and the parameters of what was ideologically acceptable had been decided by the church. But in the more tolerant atmosphere of Florence, painters represented things as they saw them, rather than as the church said they must be. It was a society well suited to the ever-questioning country boy. Leonardo commenced an apprenticeship at the studio of Andrea del Verrocchio, with whom he studied for at least 6 years. The boy mastered every medium and continued his studies of nature, discovering so much so fast that it seemed to him that everything must eventually be revealed to his searching. In painting, he not only outshone his more mature colleagues, but also his teacher. Assigned to paint the figure of an angel, he gave it a whole new dimension that drew the viewer directly into the painting in a way that Verrocchio's inhibited style could never do. Some say Verrocchio never painted again. Early masterworks. Leonardo left Florence in 1482 at the age of 30. He stayed away for 18 years. The young Florentine hoped to find the glory he sought in the court of Lodovico Sforza, ruler of Milan. A practical city, Milan cared more for knowledge than for the arts. It housed no great artists, but counted many learned men. Leonardo came as a musician, but presented himself as an engineer, describing in a long, boastful letter his inventiveness in the field of weapons. Almost as an afterthought, he assured Sforza that, "Also, I can do in painting whatever may be done, as well as any other, whoever he may be." It was as an artist that Leonardo was accepted. He established an art factory much like Verrocchio's shop in Florence, and at once accepted assignments. These included a portrait of Sforza's beautiful and learned mistress, Cecilia Gallerani, lady with an ermine, a portrait of a musician that some scholars believe is really a self-portrait, and a brilliant early version of Virgin of the Rocks, begun in 1483 and now in the Louvre. Around 1485, he began his notebooks. These are detailed cryptic compilations of material on a seemingly arbitrary range of topics, from geology and geometry to anatomy and astronomy, all interwoven and superimposed as one burning interest gave way to the next. His notes are written left-handed from right to left, and there are sketches everywhere that complement his text. His discussions were addressed to himself, leaving us an extraordinary record of the movements of his mind. Bronze Horse and Last Supper. Along with his varied duties at court, which ranged from painting to plumbing, two great works mark Leonardo's years with Sforza. One was to be a bronze statue of the Duke's late father as a conquering hero riding a horse. The other, ordered by Sforza for his favorite church, was a Last Supper. The themes were not unlike other commissions of the time, but if the subjects lacked originality, their treatment did not. The horse was to be colossal, in a pose full of motion and life. The concept was so bold, so ambitious, that it finally brought the artist the praise he sought. His contemporaries thought it could not be created, but Leonardo devised workable plans. Sadly, he was denied the chance to complete his project. War broke out, and the bronze was used for cannon instead. The Last Supper, too, was presented as never before. Leonardo arranged the 13 figures in a brilliant composition reflecting the terrible moment following Christ's words, "One of you shall betray me." He gave the figures deep emotions, varying according to their natures, perfectly illustrating the intention of each subject's soul. Unfortunately, Leonardo's brilliance was not matched by his planning. He hated deadlines and fixed schedules. Painting fresco, that is, on freshly prepared plaster, imposed both. So he worked with oil mixtures, which could be applied whenever the mood struck him. The technique suited the artist, but not the wall. The paint soon blistered and began to peel away from the damp surface. With his doomed masterworks behind him, and with the French army of Louis XII approaching the city, Leonardo left Milan, and in the spring of 1500 he was back in Florence. Battle of the Giants. Leonardo came home a famous man. No one knew or cared much about his science and his inventions, but everyone had heard of his horse and his Last Supper. Many of his competitors had either died or gone to Rome. His most serious rival was Michelangelo Buonarroti, 23 years his junior, surly, ambitious, and a great painter. The two Florentines hated each other wholeheartedly. Once again, two great works drew his artistic effort. One was a huge mural for the council chamber depicting the Battle of Anghiari, an important political victory for Florence. The other was a life-size portrait of a middle-class woman. He worked on the paintings concurrently, the portrait offering him pleasant relief from the subject of the battle. Some say the subject of the portrait is Lisa, wife of Florentine merchant Francesco del Giocondo, while others suggest different identities. Known today as Mona Lisa, it hangs in the Louvre, glass-shrouded and guarded. Its colors have suffered a strange change, as if bathed in undersea light, but the lady still glows with an inner radiance, both troubling and serene. The battle scene thrust Leonardo into an artistic rivalry with Michelangelo, who was to paint another wall of the same chamber. The rivals did their preliminary sketches in separate quarters. Both were magnificent in their own way. The younger man's picture of male bathers, interrupted by a call to arms, was as dynamic as Leonardo's cavalry confrontation. Benvenuto Cellini, who saw them both while they were still intact, wrote that they were the school of the world. Michelangelo never transferred his draft to the council chamber wall. Leonardo did, or at least he began to. Forgetting the fate of his Last Supper, or perhaps not yet aware of it, he again used an oil paint for greater freedom and brighter colors. The paint soon began to flake and run. The work was doomed, another masterpiece lost, at least until its traces were rediscovered in the 1970s. A life unfinished. Leonardo now turned from art to his old love, flight. By this time, his knowledge went far beyond the limits of his age and was approaching the understanding that much later gave men wings. But his efforts, including his legendary attempt on Monte Cecere, brought him no satisfaction, only the certainty that he himself would never fly or witness manned flight. In 1513, Leonardo journeyed south to Rome to work for the new pope, Leo X. 3 years later, he set out once again, this time for France, on the last journey of his homeless life. France's young new king, Francis I, regarded Leonardo as the wisest of men and wanted him nearby whether he painted or not. Thus he lived the 3 remaining years of his life in a small chateau among the beautiful landscape of the river Loire. In his heart, Leonardo felt defeat. His greatest works crumbling, his great knowledge undisclosed, Leonardo grieved for what might have been, for all the wondrous unfinished projects that forever filled his extraordinary mind. He had no way to know that the few magnificent works he did complete would alone make his name immortal. And so the universal man, symbol of his time and anticipator of ours, passed into eternal fame.
(9b) The Power of Writing. Joel L. Swerdlow investigates the history and future of one of humanity's most potent forms of artistic and political expression. No other invention, perhaps only the wheel comes close, has had a longer and greater impact on humanity's development than writing. Written words have overthrown governments and changed the course of history. So powerful is writing that the beginnings of civilization and history are most often defined as the moment cultures develop it. The transformation of language into written words has immortalized passion, genius, art, and science. Much of writing's power comes from its flexibility. Ever since the Sumerians began keeping records by carving signs on clay tablets 5,000 years ago, humans have searched for the ideal tool to portray words. They have carved symbols in stone and bone and written on leaves, bark, silk, papyrus, parchment, paper, and electronic screens. This skill, once known only to a few professional scribes, grew into mass literacy. More than 5 billion people, about 85% of the world's population, can now read and write. To understand how writing evolved, I visited Sarabit el-Khadim, a flat-topped wind-eroded mountain of reddish sandstone in the southwestern Sinai Peninsula of Egypt. Here, in a turquoise mine dug by Egyptians almost 3,500 years ago, is one of the earliest examples of a phonetic alphabet. "What do you think?" asked Avner Gorin as we stooped to enter a dark hole. Gorin, an archaeologist who supervised excavations in the Sinai for 15 years, was pointing to a wall just ahead of us. Carved into the stone were crude sketches of a fish, ox head, and square. The simplicity of the marks belied their significance. The people who made them were among the first to use characters that denote sounds, an alphabet. The alphabetic symbols each represented the initial sound of an object. The picture of the square, a house, thus stood for the B sound because the word for house was beat. The signs were remarkably different from the Egyptian hieroglyphs found elsewhere at the site. If these ancient writers were not Egyptians, who were they? Most researchers now believe that this alphabet was invented in Canaan, a region between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. Most likely, Canaanites who were brought in to work the mines left these messages. Egyptian scribes had to master hundreds of symbols. I asked Gorin if alphabetic writing must have seemed attractive to those scribes. Probably not, he says. About 30 of the symbols in Egyptian hieroglyphs represent single sounds, just like the alphabet. They knew about using symbols to represent sounds. To the Egyptians, the Semitic writing may have looked too primitive to be significant. Gorin warned me against seeing an alphabet as superior to pictographic writing. If you came from outer space and wrote a report, you'd give the alphabet high marks, he says. It's flexible and easy to learn. But what actual effect did that have? There was no mass literacy until after the development of the printing press in the mid-15th century. Nevertheless, although it took hundreds of years, alphabets would eventually change the way people thought. From a small patch in the Middle East, the notion of one symbol per sound gradually became widespread around the world, taking root first among the Greeks, who adapted some characters into written vowels. The Latin alphabet of the Romans evolved from the Greek around the 6th century BC. By the 9th century AD, Japan had integrated phonetic components into its written language, Korea by the 15th. Indeed, of the several hundred written languages in the world today, only Chinese still relies on a traditional writing system whereby individual characters represent individual words. These characters often mean one thing when used alone, but something else when combined. The Chinese character for sincerity, for example, shows the character for man alongside the one for word, literally a man standing by his word. Since its beginning as a means for keeping records, writing has evolved into one of humanity's most powerful forms of self-expression. People have used writing to counter loneliness and to establish a sense of self. In the 4th century BC, Aristotle saw writing as a way to express affections of the soul. Recent studies have shown that writing about feelings can alleviate depression, boost the immune system, and lower blood pressure. And yet, of the more than 10,000 languages ever spoken, most had no written form. How, then, do people in societies without writing express themselves? We talk to each other, listen, visit, and trust the spoken word, says Gu Zhao, a leader of the Haida nation. Writing is not essential to living. Expressing yourself without writing is natural. The Haida have lived on the Queen Charlotte Islands off the coast of British Columbia for more than 10,000 years. I suggest to Gu Zhao that things get distorted when people repeat them to one another, especially over a long duration of time. Things get distorted in writing as well, he says. People with writing are a brief chapter in our history. Oral histories from our people go back thousands of years. They are a living history. They provide a link between storyteller and listeners that written stories cannot. In fact, human intimacy and community can best come through oral communication. Plato, Aristotle's teacher, would probably agree. Living at a time when writing began to challenge Greece's oral-based culture, he warned that writing would make people trust to the external written characters and not remember of themselves. They will be hearers of many things and will have learned nothing. But Plato lived in the 5th century BC, when reading was physically difficult. Books were papyrus scrolls often more than 15 meters, 50 feet, long. The idea of pages only emerged in Europe in the 2nd century AD. Space between words did not become standard in Western society until the 7th century. Long after Plato's time, writing served mostly as an aid to memory, something to stimulate the spoken word. The transition from the spoken to the written word occurred because writing meets certain needs so much more effectively. Writing permits analysis, precision, and communication with both current and future generations in a way that is much more powerful than the spoken word. Thousands of years ago, China's rulers learned the value of a uniform written language, recognizing that it has the power to unite people. In the 3rd century BC, Chinese people spoke at least 8 languages and countless dialects, but with the establishment of a unified empire and a standard writing system around 200 BC, everyone could read the same characters. Today, the extra work needed to manually enter Chinese into a computer, up to 5 keystrokes for one Chinese character, raises an important issue. China could become the wealthiest country in the world. It already is a major factor in the international economy. As this economy relies more on computers, does the Chinese writing system act as a constraint on its development? Perhaps not. Usama Fayyad, a senior researcher at Microsoft Corporation, whose job is to think about the long-term future of computers and data storage, says technology will eventually offer efficient and economical ways to bypass keyboards. Technology that incorporates voice and handwriting recognition, he claims, could make it irrelevant which writing system is used. Fayyad also says that the distinction between an alphabet and Chinese characters does not matter in terms of how a computer operates. He explains that when you hit a letter on the keyboard, the computer enters that action into its memory as a number. Each letter is a different number, and a sentence inside the computer is a string of numbers. It's up to the computer program to interpret how the string of numbers corresponds to an instruction. Overall, computers are great at bookkeeping, Fayyad says, but not yet great at recording impromptu ideas, thoughts, feelings. For that, paper is still far superior. You can hold it, fold it, put it in your pocket, look at it again later when it's convenient. Fayyad's praise of paper leads me to Joseph Jacobson, a professor of physics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He helped found a company, E-Ink, whose technology is transforming ink from a permanent medium to a format that can change electronically. Paper is fantastic, Jacobson tells me as we tour E-Ink offices in Cambridge, Massachusetts. If books or newspapers on paper had not already been invented, if we lived in a world only with computer screens, then paper would be a breathtaking breakthrough. But the way we use paper is incredibly wasteful. Jacobson illustrates to me the e-ink technology he hopes will someday supplement ink on paper. It prints electronic letters on squares of plastic that can be erased and reused. I ask Jacobson why he uses plastic. Paper tears too easily, he replies. We're working on a plastic substance that looks and feels like paper. You could photocopy it, even underline on it with a special pen. Isn't that a lot of trouble to solve a problem that doesn't exist? A problem does exist, Jacobson says. Paper needs to be taken into the digital age. We need writing that changes on paper. Think about all the information people download from the internet. They don't want to read it on a computer screen, so they print it on paper. The demand for paper is soaring. Think of all the savings in cost and the pollution prevented if you needed less paper. As I watch the e-ink letters blink, I feel as if I'm back in the cave at Sarabit el-Qadim, looking at a piece of the future.
A. The pollution within. Modern chemistry makes life more convenient and helps save lives. But at what price? Writer David Ewing Duncan begins a journey of chemical self-discovery. My experiment is taking a disturbing turn. A Swedish chemist is on the phone talking about flame retardants, chemicals added for safety to just about any product that can burn. Found in carpets, electronic circuit boards, and automobiles, flame retardants save hundreds of lives a year in the United States alone. These, however, are where they should not be, inside my body. Åke Bergman of Stockholm University tells me he has received the results of a chemical analysis of my blood, which measured levels of flame-retarding compounds called polybrominated diphenyl ethers, PDBEs. In mice and rats, high doses of PBDEs interfere with thyroid function, cause reproductive problems, and slow neurological development. Little is known about their impact on human health. I hope you are not nervous, but this concentration is very high, Bergman says with a slight Swedish accent. My blood level of one particularly toxic PBDE, found primarily in U.S.-made products, is 10 times the average found in a study of U.S. residents, and more than 200 times the average in Sweden. The news about another PBDE variant is nearly as bad. My levels would be high even if I were a worker in a factory making the stuff, Bergman says. In fact, I'm a writer participating in a journey of chemical self-discovery. Last fall, I had myself tested for 320 chemicals I might have picked up from food, drink, the air I breathe, and the products that touch my skin. The secret compounds I have acquired by merely living. It includes older chemicals that I might have been exposed to decades ago, such as DDT and PCBs. It also includes pollutants like lead, mercury, and dioxins, newer pesticides, and plastic ingredients, plus other compounds that hide beneath the surface of modern life, making shampoos fragrant, pans nonstick, and fabrics water-resistant and fire-safe. The fee for the test is expensive, and only a few labs have the technical expertise to detect the amounts involved. I submitted myself for them to learn what substances build up in a typical person over a lifetime and where they might come from. Prior to the test, I had little knowledge of what was lurking inside my body. Now I'm learning more than I really want to know. First, Bergman wants to solve my flame-retardant mystery. Have I recently bought new furniture or rugs? No. Do I spend a lot of time around computer monitors? No. I use a titanium laptop. Do I live near a factory making flame retardants? Nope. The closest one is over 1,000 miles, 1,600 kilometers away. Then I come up with an idea. What about airplanes? I ask. Yeah, he says. Do you fly a lot? I flew almost 200,000 miles, 300,000 kilometers last year, I say. In fact, as I spoke to Bergman, I was sitting in an airport waiting for a flight from my hometown of San Francisco to London. Interesting, Bergman says. He tells me that he has long been curious about PBDE exposure inside airplanes, whose plastic and fabric interiors include flame retardants to meet safety regulations. I have been wanting to apply for a grant to test pilots and flight attendants for PBDEs, Bergman says. But for now, the airplane connection is only a hypothesis. Where I picked up this chemical remains a mystery. And there's the bigger question. How worried should I be? The same can be asked of other chemicals I've absorbed from air, water, the nonstick pan I used to scramble my eggs this morning, my faintly scented shampoo, my cell phone. I'm healthy and, as far as I know, have no symptoms associated with chemical exposure. In large doses, some of these substances can have horrific effects. But many toxicologists insist that the minimal amounts of chemicals inside us are, on the whole, nothing to worry about. In toxicology, dose is everything, says Carl Rosman, a toxicologist at the University of Kansas Medical Center. And these doses are too low to be dangerous. A standard unit for measuring most chemicals inside us is a ratio of 1 part per billion, ppb. An amount so small it's like putting half a teaspoon, 2 milliliters, of dye into an Olympic-sized swimming pool. Moreover, some of the most feared substances, such as mercury, normally dissipate within days or weeks unless the individual is constantly re-exposed. Even though many health statistics have improved over the past few decades, a few illnesses are rising mysteriously. From the early 1980s through the late 1990s, autism increased tenfold. From the early 1970s through the mid-1990s, one type of leukemia was up 62%, male birth defects doubled, and childhood brain cancer was up 40%. Some experts, albeit with little firm evidence, suspect there is a link to the man-made chemicals in our food, water, and air. Over the years, several chemicals that were thought to be harmless turned out to be otherwise, once the facts were in. The classic example is lead. In 1971, the U.S. Surgeon General declared that lead levels of 40 micrograms per deciliter of blood were safe. It's now known that any detectable lead can cause neurological damage in children. From DDT to PCBs, the chemical industry has released compounds first and discovered damaging health effects later. Regulators have often allowed a standard of innocent until proven guilty. Leo Tresande, a pediatrician and environmental health specialist at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York City, calls it an uncontrolled experiment on America's children. Each year, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, reviews an average of 1,700 new compounds that industry is seeking to introduce. Yet, the 1976 Toxic Substances Control Act legally requires that they be tested before approval only if there is evidence of potential harm, which is seldom the case for new chemicals. The agency approves about 90% of the new compounds without any restrictions. Only a quarter of the 82,000 chemicals in use in the U.S. have ever been tested for toxicity. Studies by an environmental organization known as the Environmental Working Group found hundreds of chemical traces in the bodies of volunteers. Until recently, no one had measured average levels of exposure among large numbers of Americans. No regulations required it. The tests are expensive, and technology sensitive enough to measure the tiniest levels didn't exist. So why take a chance on these chemicals? Why not immediately ban them? In 2004, Europe did just that for penta and octa BDEs, which animal tests suggest are the most toxic of the compounds. California will also ban these forms by 2008, and in 2004, Chemtura, an Indiana company that is the only U.S. maker of pentas and octas, agreed to phase them out. Currently, there are no plans to prohibit the much more prevalent deca BDEs. They reportedly break down more quickly in the environment and in people, although their breakdown products may include toxic pentas and octas. Nor is it clear that banning a suspect chemical is always the best option. The University of Surrey in England recently assessed the risks and benefits of flame retardants in consumer products. In its summary, the report concluded that the benefits of many flame retardants in reducing the risk from fire outweigh the risks to human health. Except for some pollutants, every industrial chemical was created for a purpose. Even DDT, the chemical whose toxic effects helped launch the modern environmental movement, was once seen as a miracle substance. It saved countless lives because it was able to kill the mosquitoes that carry malaria, yellow fever, and other diseases. Eventually, it was banned in much of the world because of its danger to wildlife. Chemicals are not all bad, says Scott Phillips, a medical toxicologist in Denver. While we have seen some cancer rates rise, he says, we also have seen a doubling of the human lifespan in the past century. The key is knowing more about these substances so we are not blindsided by unexpected hazards, says California State Senator Deborah Ortiz, chair of the Senate Health Committee and the author of a bill to monitor chemical exposure. We benefit from these chemicals, but there are consequences, and we need to understand these consequences much better than we do now. The European Union last year gave initial approval to a measure called REACH, Registration, Evaluation, and Authorization of Chemicals, which would require companies to prove the substances they market or use are safe, or that the perceived benefits outweigh any risks. The bill, which the chemical industry and the U.S. government oppose, would also encourage companies to find safer alternatives to suspect flame retardants, pesticides, solvents, and other chemicals. That would give a boost to the so-called green chemistry movement, a search for alternatives that is already underway in laboratories on both sides of the Atlantic. As disturbing as my journey of chemical self-discovery was, it left out thousands of compounds, among them pesticides, plastics, and solvents. Nor was I tested for chemical cocktails, mixtures of chemicals that may do little harm on their own but act together to damage human cells. Mixed together, pesticides, PCBs, phthalates, and others might have additive effects, or they might be antagonistic, says James Perkle of the CDC, or they may do nothing. We don't know. Soon after I receive my results, I show them to my internist, who admits that he too knows little about these chemicals other than lead and mercury. But he confirms that I am a healthy adult, as far as he can tell. He tells me not to worry, so I'll keep flying and scrambling my eggs on Teflon and using my scented shampoo. But I'll never feel quite the same about the chemicals that make life better in so many ways.
(10b) The Secrets of Sleep. From birth, we spend a third of our lives asleep. After decades of research, we're still not sure why. Writer D.T. Max investigates the secret world of sleep. If we don't know why we can't sleep, it's in part because we don't really know why we need to sleep in the first place. We know we miss it if we don't have it, and we know that no matter how much we try to resist it, sleep conquers us in the end. We know that 7 to 9 hours after we give in to sleep, most of us are ready to get up again. 15 to 17 hours after that, we are tired once more. We have known for 50 years that we divide our slumber between periods of deep wave sleep and what is called rapid eye movement, REM sleep, when the brain is as active as when we're awake, but our voluntary muscles are paralyzed. We know that all mammals and birds sleep. Fish, reptiles, and insects all experience some kind of repose, too. We know all this, but still the most basic question remains: why? William Dement, a co-discoverer of REM sleep and co-founder of the Stanford Sleep Medicine Center, knows more than most about the inner workings of sleep. As far as I know, he says, the only reason we need to sleep that is really, really solid is because we get sleepy. Unfortunately, the reverse is not always true. We don't always get sleepy when we need to sleep. Insomnia is at epidemic levels in the developed world. 50 to 75 million Americans, roughly a fifth of the population, complain about problems sleeping. 56 million prescriptions for sleeping pills were written in 2008, up 54% over the previous 4 years. The social and economic costs from the undertreatment of sleeplessness are huge. The Institute of Medicine, an independent national scientific advisory group, estimates nearly 20% of all serious motor vehicle accidents are associated with driver sleepiness. It places the direct medical cost of our collective sleep debt at tens of billions of dollars. The losses in terms of work productivity are even higher. Then there are the softer costs, the damaged or lost relationships, the muting of enjoyment in life's pleasures. The Sleep Medicine Center at Stanford, founded in 1970, was the first U.S. institute devoted to the problem of insomnia, and it remains among the most important. The Sleep Center sees over 10,000 patients a year and does more than 3,000 overnight quantitative and qualitative studies in which researchers use techniques such as videotaping and polygraph analysis to observe participants while they are asleep. The main diagnostic tool at the clinic is the polysomnogram, which captures the electrical output from a sleeping patient's brain. As you fall asleep, your brain slows down, and its electrical signature changes from short, jagged waves to longer rolling ones. In the brain, these gentle changes are interrupted periodically by a renewal of the sudden agitated mental activity of REM sleep. For unknown reasons, REM is the time during sleep when we do nearly all our dreaming. The polysomnogram data also records body temperature, muscle activity, eye movement, heart rhythms, and breathing. The researchers look over the input for signs that deviate from normal sleep, such as frequent wake-ups. When a person has narcolepsy, for instance, he or she goes from wakefulness into REM sleep without any intermediate steps. Clete Kushida, the clinic director, can discriminate between his patients' different sleep problems even at the intake interview stage. There are those who cannot keep their eyes open, and those who just speak of their exhaustion but don't actually fall asleep. The former often have sleep apnea. The latter have the attributes of what Kushida calls true insomnia. In obstructive sleep apnea sufferers, the muscle relaxation that comes with sleep causes the soft tissue of the throat and esophagus to close, shutting off the sleeper's air passage. When the brain realizes it is not getting oxygen, it sends an emergency signal to the body to wake up. The sleeper awakes, takes a breath, the brain is replenished, and sleep returns. A night's sleep for an apnea sufferer is really just 100 micronaps. Apnea is a serious problem implicated in increased risk for heart attacks and stroke, but it is only indirectly a sleep disease. True insomniacs, people diagnosed with what some sleep doctors call psychophysiological insomnia, are people who either can't get to sleep or can't stay asleep for no evident reason. They wake up and don't feel rested. They lie down and their brains remain active. This group makes up about 25% of those seen in sleep clinics, according to John Winkelman, medical director of a sleep health center in Massachusetts. While apnea can be treated with a device that forces air down the sleeper's throat to keep the airways open, the treatment of classic insomnia is not so clear-cut. First come sleeping pills. Though safer than they once were, sleeping pills can lead to psychological addiction. Many users complain that their sleeping pill sleep seems different, and they feel hungover when they wake up. The second step in treating true insomniacs is usually cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT. In CBT, a specialized psychologist teaches the insomniac to think about his or her sleep problems as manageable. That's the cognitive part. And to practice good sleep hygiene. Good sleep hygiene mostly consists of common sense advice. Sleep in a dark room, go to bed only when you're sleepy, don't exercise before bed. Studies have shown that CBT is more effective than sleeping pills at treating long-term insomnia. John Winkelman thinks CBT is more appropriate for helping some kinds of insomniacs than others. Insomnia covers a multitude of conditions. Some insomniacs suffer from restless leg syndrome, RLS, an intense discomfort in their limbs that prevents falling asleep, or periodic limb movement disorder, PLMD, which produces involuntary kicking during sleep. Narcoleptics often have difficulty both staying asleep and staying awake. Then there are people who can't sleep because of depression, and people who are depressed because they can't sleep. Age and gender are also factors. Older people in general sleep less well than young, and an individual's sex may also play a role. Women are twice as likely to have insomnia as men. Of all these non-sleepers, patients with insomnia derived from physical internal causes, probably excesses or scarcities of various neurotransmitters, are usually least able to respond to CBT treatment. For most other conditions, CBT is a potential cure. If we're not able to sleep, perhaps it's also because we've forgotten how to. In pre-modern times, people slept differently, going to bed at sunset and rising with the dawn. In winter months with so long to rest, our ancestors may have broken sleep up into chunks. In developing countries, people still often sleep this way. They bed down in groups and get up from time to time during the night. Some sleep outside where it is cooler and the effect of sunlight on our circadian rhythm is more direct. The publication in 2002 of a survey conducted by Carol Worthman and Melissa Melby of Emory University revealed how people sleep in a variety of cultures. They found that among foraging groups, the boundaries of sleep and waking are very fluid. There is no fixed bedtime, and no one tells anyone else to go to sleep. No one in developed nations sleeps this way today, at least not on purpose. We go to bed near a fixed time and sleep on soft cushions covered with sheets and blankets. We sleep on average about an hour and a half less a night than we did just a century ago. We also refuse to pay attention to our biology. The natural sleep rhythms of teenagers call for a late morning wake-up, but most teens start high school at 8 a.m. The night shift worker who sleeps in the morning is fighting ancient body rhythms that require him or her awake to hunt or forage during daylight hours. We ignore these natural cycles at our peril. In February 2009, a U.S. jet on a domestic flight from Newark to Buffalo crashed, killing all 49 aboard and 1 on the ground. The co-pilot, and probably the pilot, had only sporadic amounts of sleep the day leading up to the crash. This sort of news enrages Harvard's Charles Czeisler. He notes that going without sleep for 24 hours or getting only 5 hours of sleep a night for a week is the equivalent of a blood alcohol level of 0.1%. Yet modern business ethics celebrates such feats. As Czeisler says, we would never say, "This person is a great worker, he's drunk all the time." Starting in 2004, Czeisler published a series of reports in medical journals based on a study of 2,700 first-year medical residents. The participants were young men and women who worked shifts as long as 30 hours twice a week. Czeisler's research revealed the remarkable public health risk caused by this sleep debt. We know that 1 out of 5 first-year residents admits to making a fatigue-related mistake that resulted in injury to a patient, he told me in the spring of 2009. 1 in 20 admits to making a fatigue-related mistake that resulted in the death of a patient. He is doubtful anything much will change until U.S. employers get serious about insomnia and sleepiness. In 2008, I attended a meeting of a Spanish government commission that was investigating the impact of sleep deprivation on productivity. Spain is famous for its siesta, yet the government has become increasingly concerned about the amount of sleep Spanish people are getting. The speakers at the meeting spoke of accidents by tired workers, women exhausted by long work hours and household duties, and small children deprived of their proper 10 to 12 hours of sleep. The organizers attempted to keep the speeches short and the meeting moving, but the lights were low and the room warm. In the audience, a few participants' heads began to fall to their chests, then pop back up as they resisted. Then their eyes closed more fully, their conference programs lowering to their laps as they began to pay back their nation's sleep debt.
(11a) The World of Suleiman the Magnificent. Writer Merle Severy examines the legacy of one of the giant historical figures of the 16th century, a ruler who stood at the crossroads of East and West. Near the Hungarian town of Zigitsar, a road sign caught my eye. Suleiman. It was a dying village, the young having moved away, the old hanging on. It was named for a sultan who came long ago. A man in his garden told me. What did he do here? I heard that he died here, a woman said, the lines of many years etching her face. The old folks would know, but they are all dead now. My curiosity led me finally to a churchyard amid cornfields in the nearby countryside. A church without a village must mark some special spot. I went through the gate, past the large crucifix, and on the church facade saw an Ottoman Turkish inscription. A crescent stood by the wall, bathed in the light of the setting sun. It was at this site, I read, that was buried the heart of Sultan Suleiman. The Lord of Lords. The 16th century was an age notable for the overlapping reigns of giant historical figures. Spanish Emperor Charles V, protector of the Christian Church, his rival Francis I, King of France, Henry VIII of England, Ivan the Terrible, all-powerful ruler of the Russian Empire. Yet, even among this hierarchy of great leaders, one ruler arguably stood taller than the rest. Suleiman, commander of the faithful, shadow of God on earth, protector of the holy cities of Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem, Lord of the lords of the world, east and west. Revered by his people as Kanuni, the lawgiver, and feared and admired by the West as the Magnificent, Suleiman brought the Ottoman Empire to the peak of its power. Suleiman was born at a time of world war, of East against West, with two superpowers locked in mortal conflict on the lands and seas of 3 continents. Time and again, Christian and Muslim forces clashed in the seas around the Indian Ocean, the Red Sea, and the Mediterranean, and on land in Europe from Turkey to Austria. Away from what the Ottomans called the realm of war, the frontier against their unholy enemies was the realm of peace, where races and religions coexisted with the Sultan acting as a great mediator of peoples. At its heart was Constantinople, present-day Istanbul, a cosmopolitan crossroads of continents that grew so large no other European capital overtook it until the start of the 19th century. It was Suleiman's great-grandfather, Mehmed the Conqueror, who turned Constantinople into the greatest of all European cities. Mehmed was a descendant of nomadic tribesmen from Central Asia who became followers of Osman, the first Ottoman Sultan, in the 13th century. From these humble origins, Mehmed rose in power, carrying the banner of Islam in a series of conquests through Serbia, Greece, and Eastern Europe. Only his death in 1481 prevented him from pressing the conquest of Italy and taking Rhodes, the last Christian stronghold in the East. Mehmed's dream of achieving Alexander the Great's ambition of building a world empire that brought together East and West would eventually be taken up by his great-grandson, Suleiman. As a young man, the future sultan was educated in a river valley near the Aegean Sea, where he had been assigned as governor. Well read in history, the Quran, politics, science, astrology, and poetry, and skilled in horsemanship and archery, Suleiman had been carefully prepared for his role as a future world leader. On hearing of his father Selim's death in 1520, Suleiman rode for 3 days until he arrived in Constantinople. As he approached, Suleiman looked with fresh eyes at the city that would become his capital, the fortress with its great cannons, the dome of the magnificent Hagia Sophia, a church that had been converted to Muslim worship, the wooden houses sheltering immigrant families. In this crowded city, Spanish Moors and Jews expelled by Ferdinand and Isabella joined with Turks, Greeks, and Armenians in the shops and stalls that filled the city's covered bazaar. On September 30th, 8 days after Selim's death, Suleiman took up the sword of Osman in an elaborate ceremony and was declared sultan. From that time on, he held absolute power over the welfare of his people, with the right of instant death over any subject. But as he first rode from his palace, his people gathered to raise their voice in a ritual warning to a new monarch, "Be not proud, my sultan, God is greater than you." The Lamb and the Lion. Suleiman's first official acts were to order a tomb, mosque, and school built in honor of his father, freeing 1,500 Egyptian and Iranian captives, and paying back merchants for goods that Selim had taken from them. These won him popular approval for piety, magnanimity, and justice. It seemed to all men, one observer commented, that a gentle lamb had succeeded a fierce lion. But the lamb proved a lion in disguise. A revolt in Syria was put down savagely. Then Suleiman set out to achieve what Mehmed the Conqueror had failed to do. In his first European campaign, the city of Belgrade, the key to Christian defenses in the Balkans, fell after weeks of massed attacks. The next summer, in 1522, he besieged the Christian stronghold of Rhodes, which stood between his capital and the ports of Egypt and Arabia, including the Islamic holy city of Mecca. The siege began on July 29th and lasted 145 bloody days until the knight's desperate defense ended. Having brought into submission the strongest fortified city in Christendom, Suleiman offered generous terms. Knights and mercenaries could leave freely within 12 days. Citizens could depart at any time within 3 years. Again, he won admiration for his magnanimity. Little did he realize the price he would pay later for letting the knights go. As success followed success in his campaigns, contemporaries wrote with awe of the glories of the Sultan's empire. "I know of no state which is happier than this one," reported the Venetian ambassador in 1525. "It is furnished with all God's gifts. It controls war and peace with all. It is rich in gold, in people, in ships, and in obedience. No state can be compared with it. May God long preserve the most just of all emperors." An audience with Suleiman. The Venetian ambassador's glowing, and no doubt somewhat biased, description is perhaps understandable considering the spectacular show that was put on to welcome visitors to the Ottoman capital. A foreign ambassador's reception was carefully designed to show Ottoman grandeur and power at its most impressive. On approaching the Sultan's Topkapi Palace, the envoy first saw the heads of executed traitors hanging from the imperial gate. Passing the executioner's chambers, the envoy entered a shining portico. There he was met on the Sultan's behalf by the monarch's vizier, or grand adviser, who, on special occasions, led the envoy past 2,000 bowing officials and heaps of silver coins. The visitor was then offered 100 dishes or thereabout, most boiled and roasted. Then on to the sacred inner precincts. Visitors spoke of the silence of death itself. The ambassador was robed in gold cloth, while his royal presents were inspected, since the Sultan was not to be approached without gifts. At the door of the throne room, 2 officials held the visitor firmly by the arms. At no time would they let go. The visitor was led across the room, then forced to subordinate himself by kneeling down and kissing the Sultan's foot. He was then raised to deliver his message. The Sultan, heavy with silk, gold, and silver threads, sat on a jewel-studded throne. Suleiman might make a comment or indicate with a nod that the audience was over. The ambassador was then led backwards out of the room, never turning his back on the Sultan. The Sultan's response might come much later, usually via the Grand Vizier. The envoys who met Suleiman in this way would scan his features for signs of his health and character. From their descriptions, we know something about how the great Sultan looked, how he acted. But we know very little of his thoughts, of what really was in the mind of the Lord of Lords. The Secret Sultan. What sort of man was Suleiman? Of his private life, his attitudes, and his thoughts, we can infer very little. His campaign diaries were written in the third person without emotion. For example, from his third campaign, the emperor, seated on a golden throne, receives his viziers. Massacre of 2,000 prisoners. The rain falls in torrents. Glimpses of humanity are rare, but revealing. After the siege of Rhodes, Suleiman consoles the knight's leader for his loss, praises his brave defense, then confides to a follower, "It is not without regret that I forced this brave man from his home in his old age." We know that Suleiman showed wisdom as a lawgiver, creating a new code of laws and giving legal protection to minorities. He was also pious, consulting theologians on crucial decisions, just, allowing no corrupt or injustice to go unpunished, and usually fair. Ironically, it was an act of generosity that led, years later, to his greatest defeat. As a young man, Jean Perereau de la Valette fought against Suleiman in the siege of Rhodes, but was later released. Just over 4 decades later, La Valette led the defense of the great Christian stronghold of Malta. The surprise defeat at the hands of the Christian knights marked the beginning of the end of Ottoman domination in the Mediterranean. As the siege of Malta ended, Suleiman was entering his 73rd year, making him the longest reigning of all Ottoman monarchs. During his reign, he had extended his Islamic empire through southeastern Europe, across much of the Middle East, and in North Africa as far west as Algeria. His code of laws, known as the Kanuni Osmani, Ottoman laws, was to last more than 300 years, and he presided over some of the greatest architectural achievements in the Islamic world. Despite these achievements, Suleiman's mood became increasingly dark. To wipe out the disappointment of Malta, he set out on May 1st, 1566, to capture Vienna. The journey was painfully slow. The Sultan could no longer sit on a horse, but had to ride in a carriage. Suddenly, word came that a Hungarian count had executed one of Suleiman's governors and was now hiding in Zikitvar. In a fury, Suleiman diverted his entire army to avenge the injustice. Even with only 2,500 defenders, Zikitvar held up the Ottomans for a month, until the fortress was finally shattered by explosives. Holding up his jeweled sword in surrender, the count came out with his survivors, but there was no sultan to greet him. Suleiman had died in the night in his tent. The end of the dream. Following Suleiman's death, the Ottoman Empire was squeezed by Russian expansion in the east and European domination of southern Asia. Ottoman possessions in the Mediterranean lost their strategic role. Western technology overtook Ottoman military might, and, with no new lands, taxes, or manpower, imperial decline set in. During the 19th century, the empire became known as the sick man of Europe. Nevertheless, when more than a dozen nations emerged from its umbrella in the early 20th century, their languages, religions, and cultures had been largely preserved, a legacy, in part, of Suleiman's tolerance of minorities. 3 weeks after the emperor's death, the sultan's successor was announced, and Selim, the son of Suleiman, and his queen, Roxolana, became the new Sultan Selim II. According to Ottoman custom, Suleiman's heart was buried where he died, and the rest of his embalmed remains began the long journey home. When the Sultan's body reached the capital, the army fell silent, as did the people who followed behind in a long procession. Their leader all their lives, he raised their sacred empire to its golden age. Their descendants who looked back on it with pride and nostalgia, but they would never see his like again. The slave who became queen. Suleiman was strongly influenced by two slaves he raised to power: Ibrahim, whom he promoted to Grand Vizier, and Hurrem, Laughing One, a captive Russian known to the West as Roxolana, who became his wife. To gain influence over Suleiman, Roxolana first set out to remove Ibrahim, who had served as Grand Vizier for 13 years. With prompting from Roxolana, Suleiman began to suspect Ibrahim was acting as if he were the Sultan. One evening, Ibrahim was invited to dine with Suleiman. The next morning, he was found strangled. Next, in order to strengthen the position of her own sons, Roxolana needed to remove Mustafa, Suleiman's firstborn son. He, too, was found strangled in his father's tent. Eventually, one of Roxolana's sons, Selim, succeeded Suleiman to the throne. Rising from slavery to royalty, this strong-willed woman played a man's game with great skill for the highest stakes.
(11b) When the Moors ruled Spain. From the Rock of Gibraltar, writer Thomas J. Abercrombie set out to explore a forgotten corner of Europe's past. "Perfect weather for a morning sail, or an intercontinental passage," said my Spanish shipmate Rafa, as I scanned the rising mists ahead. Suddenly a silhouette of our destination appeared above the haze ahead. Gibraltar. "Wow, what a beauty!" Rafa exclaimed. A beacon for mariners since the dawn of seafaring, the famous Rock of Gibraltar was one of the Pillars of Hercules. Jabal Musa, behind us on the northern coast of Africa, formed the other. For ancient Romans and Greeks, the pillars marked the boundary of the known world. For me, the stronghold marked the first stop on a journey into a neglected corner of Europe's history, a distant time when Muslims ruled Spain and Islam had a powerful influence on the West. Only recently have the Spanish begun to approach their Islamic past, Rafa told me. In recent years, Rafa had presided over a Madrid-based institute that promotes cultural exchange between Spain and its Muslim neighbors. We are finding that much of what we think of as pure Spanish, our architecture, our temperament, our poetry and music, even our language, is a blend from a long Arabic heritage. Rafa and I were sailing in the wake of Tariq ibn Ziyad, a Muslim general. With soldiers and horses in 4 boats, he crossed from Ceuta on the African side, as did we, and set up his beachhead on the narrow ledge below, where the town of Gibraltar sits today. In the spring of 711, he marched northward with 12,000 Muslims. At the Rio Barbate, south of Cadiz, the invaders met the hastily assembled forces of Spain's Visigoth king, Roderick. "Before us is the enemy, behind us the sea," shouted Tariq, drawing his scimitar and invoking Allah for his blessing and support. "We have only one choice, to win." The Battle of Barbate proved a mortal wound for the weak Visigoth ruler. King Roderick was slain. His body was never recovered. Whole battalions of soldiers fled, and the Christian army collapsed. The Islamic conquest of Spain had begun. The creed of Islam had been revealed to the 7th century prophet-statesman Muhammad in distant Arabia. It spread swiftly, embracing the entire desert peninsula by the time of his death in 632. 6 years later, Syria and Palestine fell to the Muslims. From their new capital in Damascus, Muslim armies spread eastward through Mesopotamia to India and Central Asia, westward to the Nile, and across North Africa. A century after the birth of Islam, its call to prayer rang from minarets all the way from the Atlantic to the outskirts of China, an empire larger than Rome's at its height. History named the Muslim conquerors of Spain Moors, probably because they arrived by way of Morocco. The Moors themselves never used the term. They were Arabs from Damascus and Medina, leading armies of North African Berber converts. Most married into Spanish and Visigoth families or took fair-skinned Galician slaves as wives. From this mix of race and culture sprang a civilization that would have a major influence on Spain, including its language. The name Gibraltar descends from Jabal Tariq, Arabic for Tariq's mountain. From Gibraltar, I followed Tariq's footsteps northward. After the victory at the Rio Barbate, he moved swiftly, with Spanish cities falling to him in quick succession. Early in 712, his soldiers rode through the gates of the Visigoth capital, Toledo. The remaining Christian armies were forced to retreat to the northernmost mountains of Spain. The Moors' hold of Toledo was temporary, however. In 1085 it fell to Alfonso VI of Castile and Leon, who thereby initiated the Reconquista, the reconquest of Spain by the Christians. For several centuries after Toledo's recapture, the city remained liberal, tolerant, and bilingual. Alfonso X supported an important 13th century translation school where Christian, Muslim, and Jewish scholars collaborated to translate manuscripts into Latin, works by the Greek scholars Aristotle and Ptolemy, empirical studies of algebra and mathematics by al-Khwarizmi, and the canon of Ibn Sina Avicenna, which remained Europe's standard medical textbook for 500 years. Today, the whole city of Toledo has been declared a national monument. It remains the country's religious capital. Mosques and synagogues have been restored and splendid palaces opened to the public, museums to display Toledo's abundant cultural heritage. But there is a dark side, too, to the region's history. In 1469, Prince Ferdinand of Aragon wed Princess Isabella of Castile, uniting Christian Spain under their rule. They waged war against Moorish rulers to the south and persecuted Muslims and Jews in their own lands. In 1480, they established the Spanish Inquisition. Before it was over, 3 centuries later, thousands of Muslims and Jews had died, and an estimated 3 million people had been driven into exile. Having lost many of its leading businessmen, artists, and scientists, Spain found itself victim of its own cruelty. From Toledo, a train ride south brought me to Andalusia. It was here that Islamic culture sank its deepest roots. Perhaps it is not surprising. Southern Spain, with its warm, gentle landscape of grapevines and olive and citrus trees, is almost a mirror of parts of Morocco and the eastern Mediterranean. Here the Arabs felt at home. In 756, Prince Abd al-Rahman, whose dynasty had been overthrown in Syria, planted his capital at Córdoba in Andalusia's heartland. Under his successors, Córdoba blossomed into a city of 500,000 people, with more than 20 suburbs, 500 mosques, 300 public baths, 70 libraries, and long stretches of paved, lamp-lighted streets. The largest city in Western Europe, Córdoba, rivaled Baghdad and Constantinople as the greatest cultural center of the world. The highlight for most visitors to Córdoba is its mezquita, or mosque, which in 1986 celebrated its 1200th anniversary. Begun by the first Abd al-Rahman, it has a shrine that rivals in size Islam's holiest in Mecca, and still today retains its status as the crown jewel of Moorish architecture. As my eyes grew accustomed to the darkness, I wandered through a forest of more than 800 columns and Moorish arches. My footsteps led me to the mosque's domed mihrab, or prayer area. Arabic calligraphy decorated the walls, declaring, "Praise to Allah who led us to this place." In the dim vastness, I hardly noticed the cathedral. After the Christian reconquest, Catholics began using the mesquita as a church, and for 300 years held services there. Then the clergy persuaded Emperor Charles V to raise a cathedral in its midst, despite strong protests from city leaders who felt that amending the building in this way would violate its sanctity. Later, when he inspected the rather banal addition to the extraordinary mosque, Charles confessed disappointment. "By installing something that is commonplace," he declared, "you have destroyed what was once unique." When Córdoba fell to the Christian reconquest in 1236 and Seville 12 years later, the Moors found themselves confined to a 320-kilometer, 200-mile strip along Spain's southeast coast, curving from Gibraltar to Almeria. Here sultans of the Nasrid dynasty ruled from their stronghold at Granada. From 1248 to 1354, they raised their masterpiece, a clay-red palace fortress known as the Alhambra. I climbed the hill leading to the Alhambra with Professor Miguel José Haggerty, a lecturer on Arabic poetry at the University of Granada. Arab Spain nurtured scores of poets. Many of its rulers, Abd al-Rahman I, for instance, were poets in their own right, Professor Haggerty said. Strict Islamic tradition discourages the making of graven images, so painting and sculpture never flourished among the Moors. Instead, they channeled creative energy into language. With its wealth of vocabulary, its distinctive sounds, its flowing calligraphy, Arabic is well suited to the task. Little has been translated, he said, but he quoted some lines that survived the journey into Spanish and English. From Ibn al-Sabuni, "I present you a precious mirror. Behold there the beauty that consumes me. O furtive love, your reflection is more yielding and better keeps its promises." The Nasrid rulers' mansions of the Alhambra make up the most visited site in Spain. It is a miracle that they survived the centuries. They had been abused by squatters, eroded by neglect, and suffered various appendages, including a massive addition built during the Renaissance by Charles V. The integrity of the Alhambra endures nonetheless, a sublime Moorish mix of artifact and nature. Here the walls themselves speak, if you know Arabic. We found quotations and poems in the calligraphy of the walls, archways, and fountains. One marble fountain declared, "No greater mansions I see than mine, no equal in East or West." I had to agree. Even in the oil-rich Arab countries of today, architects with unlimited budgets have yet to match the Alhambra. The marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella sealed the fate of the weakening Granada sultans. In 1492, the same year they launched Christopher Columbus on his historic voyage across the Atlantic, the king and queen rode into Granada to preside over the abdication of the last Moorish ruler, Muhammad Abdu Abdallah Boabdil, as the Spanish call him. On the way out of Córdoba, I paused at a pass above the city called Suspiro del Moro, the sigh of the Moor. It was here Boabdil stopped to look back and shed a tear over his lost kingdom. According to legend, his domineering mother, Aisha, berated him for passively allowing his kingdom to fall. Fitting you cry like a woman over what you could not defend like a man. The remote villages of the Alpujarras, halfway up the southern slopes of Mulhacén, Spain's highest peak, were the last domains of the Moors in Spain until they were finally driven into exile in 1609. Many towns still wear their Arabic names, as does Mount Mulhacén and the Alpujarras itself. I descended from the mountains via a series of sharp turns to a very different world, Spain's Costa del Sol, tropical, cosmopolitan, and booming. Last year, 50 million visitors came to Spain, Costa del Sol Tourist Board promotion manager Diego Franco told me. One for every Spaniard and then some. It's an invasion, but a peaceful one. All over the coastal region are signs that modern-day Moors have joined the peaceful invasion. Signs in Arabic script point you to the Lebanese delicatessen, the Banco Saudi Español, to Arab doctors, a Muslim cemetery. Near the Andalusia Plaza Casino, I drank coffee with Morcles George El Khoury, a Christian Arab who moved here from Beirut to run a building management firm. Andalusia reminds me of Lebanon, without the wars and politics, George said. You have the mountains, the sea, the fine climate of olives and palm trees. The Spanish are a warm people, not stiff and formal like many Europeans. The food is much like ours, so is the shape of the houses and the towns. To an Arab, well, Andalusia feels like home. Nowhere is this more true than in the old Muslim capital of Córdoba, where I spent my last Spanish days. I was awakened there early one morning by the noise of workmen at the mezquita across the street. No other artifact more richly evokes the golden age of the Moors, a stormy millennium that brought together two faiths, two cultures, two continents. Throughout, while king and sultan fought bitterly for the hand of Spain, ordinary life prospered as people of different backgrounds worked together to create the brilliant civilization that helped lead Europe out of the Dark Ages. Ultimately, the Moors themselves faded into history, leaving behind their scattered dreams, but Spain and the West stand forever in their debt. Flamenco. Arabic poetry was crafted above all for recital and song. In Morocco and Spain, the soul-stirring music of cante hondo, the deep song of gypsy flamenco, is still played and sung by descendants of ethnic minorities who survived the Inquisition centuries ago. Throughout Spain, the art of flamenco is threatened by its commercialization in shows called tablos, characterized by dramatic lighting and loud amplifiers. Sacrificed in the process is flamenco's most distinctive aspect, its duende, soul. But after midnight, it is still possible to sample flamenco puro, pure flamenco, in the bars of Granada's Albaicin area, when gypsies gather to recall the moods and rhythms of a lost age.
(12A) From Clams to Credit Cards. Writer Peter T. White traces the history of one of humanity's oldest creations, from the beginnings of coinage in antiquity to the emergence of a cashless society. What is money? In its usual definition, money is anything that is accepted as a medium of exchange and a store of value because it exists in limited quantities and, above all, because people have confidence in it. But at a market in Yemen, I found quite a few people who retained a more traditional view of what sort of money can be considered sound. At Souk al-Tal, a Saturday market close to the ancient city of Saddah, I found bearded money changers sitting on concrete steps, curved daggers strapped around their waists, automatic rifles resting on their laps. In front of them were bundles of banknotes, Yemeni rials, and stacks of silver coins. The coins were all dated 1780, and the lady portrayed on them was the Austrian Empress Maria Theresa. A man had just bought 1,000 of them for 75,000 rials. I asked him why. "It is the main currency," he said. "But isn't that what the rial is?" He explained that in this area these coins are omla saba, meaning hard currency. He then walked off with 60 pounds, 27 kilograms, of silver in a woven bag. He bought them to make a profit. Another man told me they'd been going up in price, or one might say the rial had been going down. The people you saw in Saddah may be illiterate, but they know economic affairs, said Mohammed Saeed Alatar when I visited him at the Ministry of Trade in Yemen's capital, Sana'a. He told me that in the 18th century, when French traders came to the port of Mocha to buy coffee, the Yemenis didn't want French money, but they liked the Austrian coin called a thaler because of its high silver content. From thaler, incidentally, comes the word dollar. The reputation of the Austrian thaler spread through much of the Arabian Peninsula and to Ethiopia, where the coin circulated until the 1950s. We introduced the rial banknote, Dr. Alatar added, after the 1962 revolution that had ousted the monarchy. But for years, we had difficulty getting people to trust paper money. The official Austrian mint in Vienna continues to turn out Maria Theresa thalers, still dated 1780. So do foreign imitators, said a merchant in the Sana'a souk. They have agents in Yemen buy thalers, which are 83% silver, Dr. Alatar told me. They melt them down, strike new ones, and send them back to Yemen, less than 80% silver. Alas, debasing coinage for a bit of profit is almost as old as coinage itself. Coins, notes, and clams. Many of today's currencies, the Italian lira, the British pound, the peso and peseta of Spanish-speaking countries, are named for units of weight once used to measure amounts of metal. Silver, gold, and copper have functioned as money throughout most of recorded history. The earliest documented use of silver for payment appears around 2500 BC in Mesopotamian cuneiform tablets. Some of the oldest known coins were made in the ancient kingdom of Lydia in the 7th century BC. Tiny, thumbnail-sized lumps of electrum, a pale yellow alloy of gold and silver washed down by streams from limestone mountains. The coins were likely conceived as a convenience to the state, to be used as a standard medium for payments to officials and for public expenditures. They were also useful for collection of taxes levied by ancient rulers. But merchants, long used to settling accounts in precious metals, must have found them useful too. By using coins, they didn't have to do as much weighing for each transaction. The idea of coinage spread from Asia Minor across the Mediterranean world. By the 4th century BC, a weight unit called the shekel lent its name to silver coins in the Middle East. Gold was coined into the auris of the Roman Empire, the dinar of Muslim lands, the florin of Florence, and the ducat of Venice. The earliest paper currency issued by a government appeared in China in the 11th century. A couple of centuries later, in Persia, the Mongol ruler, Gekatu, tried to enforce the use of paper money, but merchants refused to accept it. They closed their shops and hid their goods. Trade stopped. Facing revolt, Gekatu revised his decision. The official who had originally suggested it was torn to pieces in a bazaar. Despite these initial setbacks, paper money would eventually become the norm. The first European banknotes were printed in Sweden in 1661, when coins were in short supply. Soon after, paper notes were widespread across continents. But money hasn't always been metal or paper. One of the oldest forms may have been a shiny white or straw-colored mollusk shell, just a couple of centimeters long, from the Indian Ocean. It's called the cowrie, and from it derives the Chinese character chai, representing wealth or money. I once saw a display of other forms of money collected by John Linker of the International Primitive Money Society, a bronze drum from Malaysia, a block of salt from Ethiopia, a bowl with 11 legs from Fiji, and wampum, once prized by North American Indians, tiny clamshell pieces drilled and strung together like beads. All these tell stories, just as coins do, said Mr. Linker. A means of exchange. The historian Fernand Braudel has pointed out how, in the Middle Ages, the role of money, and hence trade and the entire economy of Europe, got a boost from Italian ingenuity. A new scheme was found to get around the ban of the church on the lending of money at interest. Merchants of Tuscany, especially from Siena and Florence, employed this new system at the fairs of northeastern France in the 13th century. It was called the Bill of Exchange, and it opened the door to modern banking. I asked Michel Cassandro, professor of modern economic history at the University of Siena, to clarify for me how it worked. It would say, for example, Senior A, having received so many CNE scudi, will pay Senior B so many Florentine florins at such and such a place on such and such a date. That looks like a currency exchange transaction, but in fact it is a loan agreement, with the interest hidden in the amount of florins Senior A will be paying. But there's nothing that specifies it's a loan, and there's no clause in the agreement that mentions interest, so there's nothing illegal. Outside the Renaissance palace of the Monte dei Paschi di Siena Bank, I found another example of Italian ingenuity. A foreign exchange machine, operating around the clock for the convenience of tourists. Put in banknotes in any of a dozen European currencies, or Japan's yen, or Canadian, Australian, or U.S. dollars. In no more than 15 seconds, a compartment opens, and there's the equivalent in Italian lira, down to the last small coin. An electronic display shows the exchange rates, fluctuating daily. For many years after World War II, foreign exchange rates were pretty much fixed. I remember seeing a Washington, D.C. exhibit of banknotes from nearly every country in the world, each with a notation of its value in terms of the U.S. dollar. Under the dollar bill it said, equal to 1/35 of a troy ounce of gold. During this time, foreign governments were allowed to redeem dollars for gold at the U.S. Treasury. But eventually, the demand increased so much that the gold exchange standard was suspended in 1971 and formally abandoned in 1978. Not that the world's governments have discarded their gold bars. They keep lots of them as part of their reserves. In the world's largest gold depository, the subterranean vaults of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, some 60 countries store over 9 million kilograms, 10,000 tons, of gold bullion. The U.S. Treasury holds thousands of tons more, mainly in the famous vaults at Fort Knox, Kentucky, at West Point, New York, and in Denver, Colorado. The abandoning of the gold standard led to a paradigm shift in the way currencies are rated. Ever since the world's nations ceased relying on a direct link between currency and gold, currencies have been floating against each other, at prices reflecting demand and supply. Governments try to keep such prices within certain limits, but, as has often been the case in recent years, market forces can bring about drastic fluctuations. In any case, today's worldwide foreign exchange market is the biggest trading system ever, with an estimated daily turnover of $1 trillion. The value of money. Back home, I came across a formula that bankers and financial analysts know, that in fact everybody should know, the Rule of 72. No one is certain who first discovered the rule, but the principle is quite simple. Divide any number into 72, and the answer is the number of years it will take for a sum to double in financial terms. For instance, imagine you are charged 18% interest on the unpaid balance of your credit card account. 18 goes into 72 4 times, so the debt will double in 4 years. The same will be true of any investment. Say your annual salary raise is 6%. That number goes into 72 12 times, so in 12 years your salary will double. And what if, at the same time, inflation runs at 6% a year? Then after a dozen years, your money will be worth half as much. So, in a sense, you'll be back where you started. But look what can happen when inflation doesn't run at 6%, but rises at a much faster rate. That can occur when governments issue more and more currency to cover increasing obligations as prices rise. When that happens, inflation can run wild. In 1986, Peru's currency, the sol, which is Spanish for sun, fell to 14,000 to the U.S. dollar. So the government cut off 3 zeros and called it the inti, which means sun in Quechua, a language spoken by indigenous Peruvians. By mid-1991, a cup of coffee cost 500,000 intis. The government cut off 6 more zeros and called it the sol again. Over 5 years, the inflation rate was 2,200,000%. The most drastic inflation ever? Hungary, 1946, after World War II, when Germany had taken away the national bank's gold reserves. By June, the Hungarian pengo appeared in notes of 1,000,000,000 billion, which would look like this. Then the gold came back. Confidence returned, and in August, Hungary had a stable new currency, the forint. Toward a cashless society? Less than 10 years after World War II, a new means for payment in place of currency began to spread from the U.S. to much of the world, the use of so-called plastic money, meaning charge cards and credit cards. ATM cards for use in automated teller machines have since proliferated across much of the globe, while charge card payments are now commonplace everywhere, from gas stations to supermarkets. In cities from London to Singapore, electronic scanners now allow road toll payments to be automatically deducted without drivers having to slow their car. From metal to notes to plastic, money has come a long way since its early days in ancient Mesopotamia, more than 4 millennia ago. Soon, perhaps, we will all be living in a world where money is virtual, where notes, coins, and plastic cards are things of the past. In whatever form it takes, money will likely continue to play a central role in our lives, providing the fuel that keeps society moving.
(12b) Gold, a global obsession. From an open mine in an Indonesian rainforest to an elaborate wedding ceremony in southern India, writer Brooke Larmour follows the path of humanity's most desired commodity. As a girl growing up on the remote Indonesian island of Sumbawa, Nurpia heard tales about vast quantities of gold buried beneath the mountain rainforests. They were legends until geologists from an American company, Newmont Mining Corporation, discovered a curious green rock near a dormant volcano about 13 kilometers, 8 miles, from her home. The rock's mossy color meant it contained copper, an occasional companion to gold, and it wasn't long before Newmont began setting up a mine named Batu Hijau, meaning green rock. Nurpia, then 24, replied to a Newmont ad seeking operators, thinking that she might be able to get a job answering phones. When she arrived for training, her boss showed her a different kind of operating booth, the cab of a Caterpillar 793, one of the world's largest trucks. Standing 6 meters, 21 feet tall, and 13 meters, 43 feet long, the truck was bigger than her family home. Its wheels alone were double her height. The truck terrified me, Nurpia recalls. Another shock soon followed when she saw the mine itself. They had peeled the skin off the earth, she says. I thought, whatever force can do that must be very powerful. 10 years later, Nurpia, the daughter of a Muslim cleric, is part of that force herself. Pulling a pink headscarf close around her face, she smiles demurely as she starts up the Caterpillar's engine and heads into the pit at Batu Hijau. Her vehicle is part of a fleet of more than 100 trucks that removes close to 100 million tons of rock from the ground every year. For millions of years, a 550-meter, 1,800-foot volcano stood here, but now no hint of it remains. Layers of rock have been removed, and the space the volcano once occupied has been turned into a 1.6-kilometer, 1 mile, wide pit that reaches more than 100 meters, 345 feet, below sea level. By the time the gold supplies at Batu Hijau have been depleted in 20 years or so, the pit will be about 450 meters, 1,500 feet, below sea level. The environmental impact doesn't concern Nurpia anymore. I only think about getting my salary, she says. There is one thing, however, that Nurpia finds curious. In a decade at Batu Hijau, she has never seen a speck of the gold she has helped mine. The engineers monitoring the process track its presence in the copper compounds that are extracted. And since the gold is shipped out to smelters overseas, nobody on Sumbawa ever sees the hidden treasure that has transformed their island. Newmont is one of several giant mining corporations that are pursuing gold to the ends of the earth, from the lowlands of Ghana to the mountaintops of Peru. Part of the challenge of mining for gold is that there is so little of it. In all of history, only about 160,000 tons, 145 million kilograms, of gold have been mined, barely enough to fill 2 Olympic-sized swimming pools. More than half of that has been extracted in the past 50 years. Now the world's richest deposits, particularly those in the U.S., South Africa, and Australia, are fast being depleted, and new discoveries are rare. In recent years, attracted by the benefits of operating in the developing world, lower costs, higher yields, fewer regulations, Newmont has generated tens of thousands of jobs in poorer regions of the world. But it has also come under attack from conservationists who have filed complaints about unrestrained ecological destruction and the forced relocation of villagers. At Batu Hijau, where Newmont is responsible for the mine's operation, the company has responded by spending more on its community development and environmental programs, and dismissing its critics. Why is it that activists thousands of miles away are yelling, but nobody around the mine complains? Asks Malik Salim, Batu Hijau's senior external relations manager. Gold is what drives everybody crazy. Gold has been driving people crazy for millennia. The desire to possess gold has driven people to extremes, fueling wars and conquests, boosting empires and currencies, leveling mountains and forests. Gold is not vital to human existence. It has, in fact, relatively few practical uses. Yet its chief attractions, its unusual density and malleability, along with its imperishable shine, have made it one of the world's most desired commodities, a symbol of beauty, wealth, and immortality. From pharaohs, who chose to be buried in what they called the flesh of the gods, to financiers, who, following Sir Isaac Newton's advice, made it the foundation of the global economy, nearly every society has invested gold with an almost mythological status. Humankind's feverish attachment to gold shouldn't have survived the modern world. Few cultures still believe that gold can give eternal life, and every country in the world, the United States was last in 1971, has done away with the gold standard, which the economist John Maynard Keynes famously called a barbarous relic. But gold's appeal not only endures. Fueled by global uncertainty, it grows stronger. Aside from extravagance, gold is also reprising its role as a safe haven in financially unstable times. Gold's recent surges have been amplified by concerns over a looming global recession. In 2007, demand exceeded mine production by 59%. Gold has always had this kind of magic, says Peter L. Bernstein, author of The Power of Gold. But it's never been clear if we have gold or gold has us. While investors flock to gold-backed funds, jewelry still accounts for 2/3 of the demand, generating a record $53.5 billion in worldwide sales in 2007. In the U.S., an activist-driven No Dirty Gold campaign has persuaded many top jewelry retailers to stop selling gold from mines that cause severe social or environmental damage. But such concerns have little impact on the biggest consumer nations, namely China, which surpassed the U.S. in 2007 to become the world's second largest buyer of gold jewelry and, above all, India. Nowhere is the gold obsession more culturally entrenched than in India. Per capita income in this country of 1 billion people is $2,700, but it has been the world's runaway leader in gold demand for several decades. In 2007, India consumed 773.6 tons of gold, about 20% of the world gold market, and more than double that purchased by either of its closest followers, China, 363.3 tons, and the U.S., 278.1 tons. India produces very little gold of its own, but its citizens have hoarded up to 18,000 tons of the yellow metal, more than 40 times the amount held in the country's central bank. India's obsession stems not simply from a love of extravagance or the rising prosperity of an emerging middle class. For Muslims, Hindus, Sikhs, and Christians alike, gold plays a central role at nearly every turning point in life, most of all when a couple marries. There are some 10 million weddings in India every year, and in all but a few, gold is crucial both to the spectacular event itself and to the transaction between families and generations. It's written into our DNA, says K.A. Babu, a manager at the Alapat jewelry store in the southwestern city of Cochin, Kochi. Gold equals good fortune. The importance of gold is most obvious during the springtime festival of Akshaya Tritiya, considered the most auspicious day to buy gold according to the Hindu calendar. The quantity of gold jewelry Indians purchase on this day, 49 tons in 2008, so exceeds the amount bought on any other day of the year throughout the world that it often pushes gold prices higher. We grow up in an atmosphere of gold, says Ranjith Leen, a magazine editor based in Kerala, a relatively prosperous state on India's southern tip that claims just 3% of the country's population, but 7 to 8% of its gold market. When a baby is born, a grandmother rubs a gold coin in honey and places a drop of the liquid on the child's tongue for good luck. When the child is 3 years old, a learned family member takes a gold coin and traces words on the child's tongue to give the gift of eloquence. Aside from its cultural significance, gold is also the bedrock of the Indian economy. Gold is the basis of our financial system, says K.A. Babu. People see it as the best form of security, and nothing else lets you get cash as quickly. Hoarding gold as an intergenerational family nest egg is an ancient tradition in India. So, too, is pawning gold jewelry for emergency loans and then buying it back. As the price of the metal goes up, however, poor Indian families are having a harder time raising the gold they need for dowries. Rajam Chidambaram, a 59-year-old widow living in a slum on the outskirts of Cochin, recently found a young man to marry her only daughter, age 27. The groom's family, however, demanded a dowry far out of her reach. 25 sovereigns, or 200 grams, 7 ounces, of gold, worth more than $5,000 today. Chidambaram, a cleaning woman, has only the 2 earrings she wears. The gold necklace she once owned went to pay off her deceased husband's hospital bills. I had to agree to the groom's demand, Chidambaram says, wiping away tears. If I refuse, my daughter will stay home forever. In the end, local financiers advanced a loan for her daughter's dowry. Her daughter may now be married, but Chidambaram is now faced with a debt that she may spend the rest of her life trying to repay. 4,000 kilometers, 2,500 miles away, in her new house in the village of Jerawa, Nirpia is focused more on the present than the future. So many people depend on me, she says. Her husband makes some money as a timber trader, but Nirpia's salary, about $650 a month, paid for their 2-story concrete home. As if in tribute, she has hung a large painting of the yellow caterpillar 793 on her wall. Nirpia's job is not without its hardships. Maneuvering the enormous truck over a 12-hour shift is especially stressful, she says, when the pit's graded roads are slicked by torrential rains. But now, after a long day, she smiles contentedly as her child, age 6, falls asleep on her lap. The girl's middle name? Hygrid, the Indonesian approximation of high grade, the best ore in the mine. A golden wedding. The gold ornaments come out of the velvet boxes one by one, family treasures that Nagavi, a 23-year-old Indian bride, always knew she would wear on her wedding day. The eldest daughter of a coffee plantation owner in the southern Indian state of Karnataka, Nagavi grew up marveling at the weddings that marked the merger of two wealthy Indian families. But not until the morning of her own arranged wedding to the only son of another coffee plantation family does she understand just how beautiful the golden tradition can be. By the time Nagavi is ready for her wedding, the university graduate has been transformed into an Indian princess covered in gold. An elaborately crafted hairpiece is so heavy, 2.5 kilograms, 5.5 pounds, that it pulls her head back. 3 gold necklaces and a dozen other pieces of jewelry act as effective counterweights. As the family members convene, Nagavi walks slowly out of her home, trying to keep her balance as she tosses rice over her head in a traditional gesture of farewell. The gold treasures Nagavi wears are not a traditional dowry. In this circle of coffee growers around the town of Chikmagalur, unlike in many poorer parts of the country, it is considered inappropriate for a groom's family to make explicit demands. This is seen as my share of the family wealth, says Nagavi, gazing at the millions of dollars of gold jewelry. As with any Indian wedding, the gold also serves to display the value she brings to the union. With daughters, you have to start saving gold from the day they are born, says Nagavi's father, C.P. Ravi Shankar. It's important to marry them off well.